So we want to welcome everybody, and we thank you for joining us today to discuss art and auto trends in 2020 and 2021. My name is Colleen Boyle, and I'm the Senior Vice President at Palm Art Advisors, and I'll be moderating today's session. Joining me is John Wiley, who is the Manager of Valuation Analytics for Haggerty. John joined Haggerty from Zillow, where he was a data scientist and has his master's in applied mathematics from the University of Chicago. He now leads Haggerty's market analysis. He's a longtime car fanatic, and his non-car fanatics include running. We have some background noise. Also joining us is Anita Harriet, who is president at Palm Art Advisors, and a nationally acclaimed, recognized speaker on the topic of art collections and appraisals. Anita is a member of the Appraisals Association of America, and she's testified as a specialist witness in major court cases involving art valuations. Anita grew up in a family of art collectors and is a graduate of Bowdoin College with advanced degrees from University of London and New York University. Anita has also appeared in several TV shows and is frequently interviewed by the media for her insights into the art world. So over the past year, as you all know, it has been a little bit more than tumultuous. There's been countless crises surrounding the global pandemic, as well as social and political ruptures altering nearly every aspect of daily life. It was a year of protests and pivots, and that also impacted the art and car market. So Anita, why don't you start today's session and just share with us your thoughts regarding how the COVID pandemic impacted the art market in 2020?
Thanks so much, Colleen, and I hope everyone can hear me clearly. And again, everyone, don't forget to mute yourselves so that we have no background noise. You know, I just remember last January having a call with my team, and the art advisory team was in a panic because of the protests in Hong Kong. We thought that was the biggest problem that would face us in the art year in January. And then at the same time, the panic came because Brexit was on its way. And we thought, oh my God, London's going to be a disaster. Europe's going to be an issue. And we've got Hong Kong. That was an absolute little die compared to COVID. So when all three seem to be lurking in front of us, we really have to figure out how are we going to handle this art market. And it's really very, very interesting what happened. So the first thing to keep in mind is that if we look at June, from January to June 2019 and compare it to January to June 2020, you know, there were some very interesting statistics in which we could do some analysis. The first thing we found is both needed to suddenly figure out how they were going to actually sell art in a scenario where people could not walk into an auction house and get a paddle. Started to kind of move to digital, and they were ahead of the game as it compared to Christie's. And that reflects very quickly when we look at the results of the spring. While both of them were down quite significantly, I mean, there was really as much as a 49% decrease overall. However, Sotheby's came out much stronger than Christie's. The biggest, most profound change is that prior to COVID, none of us who work in the art world could have ever imagined paintings in the millions selling online without anyone seeing them in person. We saw a 497% increase in the area of virtual auctions. So that the online auction space dramatically changed and impacted the success of the spring market, and certainly had a huge impact on, I think, the art going forward. I could opine on that a little bit more, but let's hear from John.
Okay. Yeah, John. So Anita mentioned in the art world, one of the biggest transitions due to COVID was really everybody buying online. Even though the sales volume was less in 2020 compared to 2019, there still were a lot of records set. From the standpoint of the car market, did you find the similar impact due to COVID? Were more people buying online, or were there different channels for acquisition and selling? Were less cars sold or more cars sold? What did you find from the standpoint of COVID having an impact on the car market?
Yeah, thank you, Colleen. It was interesting because we, again, similarly, back in January and March, we expected 2020 to be, fairly quiet year. We had some issues, concerns around Brexit, but certainly nothing as to what transpired. Actually, and there was one last sort of auction week in early March, which was remarkably normal. Of course, shortly after that, the shutdown started to happen in the US, and everybody became a lot more concerned about things. However, both the live auction companies and the online auction companies really had a pretty stellar year this year in 2020. So we actually saw that overall, the online auction companies started to sell. They sold about $450 million worth of vehicles, and ended up being about 2/3 of total sales from auctions in 2020 since March. So the online auctions really picked up and helped out with the auction market. However, unlike the art market, the car market is primarily a private market. And we saw, even though auction sales were down a little bit, and from last year, about 8-9% in terms of total number of vehicles sold, the private market actually picked up. And so the private market is about 9 times larger. And we saw about a 17% increase in the number of transactions in the private market. So a combination of things, I think, happened in the car market in 2020. The online auction platforms and the online auctions that were available, that really grew. But also the private market grew even more as people were stuck at home and had fewer sort of entertainment options.
Colleen, I would actually add, jumping off John, that when we look at the private sales within the auction houses, there's a little background noise there. There's a huge jump in terms of private sales. Sotheby's had 50% increase in private sales. Christie's had 59% increase in private sales. So we did see that as well. The second thing I would mention in terms of COVID, in terms of impact, is what people are buying. So 19th century, modern and impressionist, American paintings decrease in value. Post-war contemporary stabilized, and in some case world records. We saw world records, and for called mid-career artists. And that's primarily to collectors that are of a certain age were very uncomfortable with the online platform. They simply didn't want to sell their art in an online platform. But younger people, guys or equity gals who are interested in post-war contemporary, they don't mind buying online. They got very activated in the market. We saw generational impacts, and then that impacted, of course, what people were buying as well.
Okay, thanks, Anita, for that insight. Did you find with the online platform, Anita, that there were more millennial buyers in the marketplace? And if so, in addition to contemporary, can you segment it a little bit further? Were you finding that people were buying more, say, for example, artwork created by female artists or artwork created by artists of color? Can you just opine a little bit on that aspect of the art market in 2020?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that, this is the time of the millennial. The millennials in world primarily were out of their minds. Second of all, because they were looking for alternative assets. So that certainly was a new generation that was starting to buy significantly at online. In terms of what they were buying, I mentioned, mid-career artists. So what we saw was kind of post-war contemporary artists that have a strong secondary market that's kind of a known name continued. I mean, we just tracked the Andy Warhol sales recently. And, we bid on several of them at a very good market price, and we were outbid. So kind of known names continue to sell well. We also saw female artists were somewhat, it's not recession proof, I'll call it COVID proof. So many female artists, your Lee Krasners, your Joan Mitchells, your Bridget Rileys, your Cecily Brown, continue to be very strong and grow significantly. We saw that the G. Williams sale, and you saw the One Global World sale of Christie's, the Joan Mitchells, did stupendously well. We also saw a huge interest in African American artists, and we're talking about mid-career, well-established, institutionally held artists, and very, very successful. The last thing I would mention is that, remember I mentioned that Hong Kong scenario where we thought, oh God, with the protests. In fact, China got out of COVID first, and knew what they were doing. Taiwan knew what they were doing, and hence themselves back into the art market very, very quickly. In fact, just tracked the Hong Kong market for the fall, and they're at 5-year highs. So it's a very interesting development in terms of who's buying as well.
Okay, thank you, Anita. And John, did you find also with increased in private sales and online sales, did you see maybe more millennials in that position of buying, as well as, can you share with everybody what were some of the top car sales that you saw in 2020? Is there anything trending that's really hot right now? And also, can you share maybe what's not so hot?
Yeah, I mean, I think with the online sales and especially with interest from millennials and Gen Xers, certainly sort of affordable classics are also sometimes called young timers. So cars built in the 1980s and 1990s. These are becoming pretty popular, especially those under $50,000, although some vehicles are in that group are now approaching $500,000. So they're becoming a bit less affordable. These groups, young timers, affordable classics, are sort of these sporty cars, often from both American, Japanese, and European manufacturers. So cars like Mustangs, BMWs, Toyota Supras. A lot of these are becoming more popular with the younger generations. Also vintage trucks and SUVs. However, one thing that in terms of the top sales in 2020, what happened, I think for the first time since, I don't know, the early 90s, the top 5 sales of the top 10 sales, the first 5 as ranked by the dollars were pre-war Bugattis. So some of you may know that Bugatti, even after they introduced the Veyron in 2006, they were a pre-war car maker. So they were the premier race car manufacturer in the 1920s and sports car maker in the 1930s. So those cars from the 1920s and 1930s, those Bugattis, occupied the top 5 spots in terms of auction sales in 2020. And that hasn't happened in a long time. It's been typically Ferraris and Jaguars and Aston Martins and Mercedes-Benz. So to me, that shows that there is still a lot of 20s and 1930s. To me, sort of what you might characterize as old masters in the art world, although I'm not an art expert. But so yeah, there's kind of a little bit of a difference in terms of growth areas, but also in terms of top sales. So that's different trends in the car market.
I would just like jump on that. What you mentioned, the old masters, let's correct that. That's more like looking at the Picassos. So, and we saw that as well. So what's always this great interest in post-war contemporary, it crosses generations, it crosses global acquisition appetite. The top artists still remain supreme. Picasso still remains, at the very top 5, absolutely. Monet still is in the top 5, absolutely. Giacometti is in the top, Modigliani. So while, yes, there's a greater interest in post-war contemporary, those artists that are at the foundation of the development of art history, the very best examples, still achieve very, very high prices.
Great. Thanks, Anita. And then, John, you'd mentioned briefly about Ferraris, and we've always seen Ferraris as being one of those top-selling cars. Are you seeing them still continuing to be a top-selling vehicle going into 2021? And what about muscle cars? Can you just talk a little bit about that market as well?
Yeah, thanks. We did hear, especially with the private market, we learned that the very best Ferraris, so these are tens of millions of dollars, if not at least $1 million. Those cars that were built sort of in the Enzo era, so sort of early 1950s up into the early 1970s, continue to do, the very best of those continue to do well. The Ferrari 250 GTO, this is a 1962 to 1964 model, of which there are 36 or so produced. That the very best of those is still a $70 million car. That hasn't changed. However, in terms of some of the larger production models of that era, some cars like the Ferrari Daytona, that's a little bit weaker, although the Dino has shown a little bit more appreciation. So that's the 246 Dino. In terms of the what was it? Oh, the muscle car market. That is also a little bit of an issue with the online auction participants and the market segment, sort of at a mismatch. So that segment has been traditionally a live auction feature, and auction companies like Barrett-Jackson, which postponed their Scottsdale event until March, really specialized in muscle cars. So that segment has been a little bit quieter. However, January auctions, which we now have tabulated, especially with Mecum auction in Kissimmee, Florida, really show that the muscle car market is picking up again, but it really does depend on that live auction format.
Talking about live versus virtual, Anita, you had mentioned that was one of the more significant changes in the art world, was the fact that really everything has gone online, with also an increase of private transactions. For individuals who are looking to buy art going into 2021, and with the auction houses still being predominantly virtual, as well as all the art fairs being virtual, can you address maybe just some pointers on maybe some due diligence practices or concerns that buyers should be aware of with purchasing via an online platform?
Absolutely. I mean, the first thing I would say is for very expensive works, kind of approach has been developed, and I bet it's the same in the car market. So essentially, when we were bidding on auction on behalf of our clients, both in the spring and in the fall, we actually did see all of those pieces in person. In fact, we were just at Sotheby's yesterday viewing that beautiful Botticelli that is on exhibition. So you can still see the pieces in person, but you must have someone who knows what they're doing looking at the objects on your behalf. The key to due diligence is intelligence and knowledge. So the biggest issue, I would say, around online is condition. Condition, and in addition, I don't know if you've ever looked at a Sotheby's or a Christie's catalog, but we always have the great opportunity of, seeing them in the catalog, seeing them in person, and they can be very different animals, right? Pictures can be slightly altered, so what the auction houses have done to address this issue is two-part. One, they will allow you to go in and see the object if it's above a certain threshold. And two, they're conducting videos now. So the videos add a live dimension to it. They can't, make that portrait of a woman look just a little bit more beautiful. So you want to make sure condition is exactly as kind of described. The other thing to keep in mind is that at a lot of these auction houses, with or without COVID, with or without online, who's doing the condition reports, right? You may have a junior cataloger just kind of describing what a work looks like, say, minor chip in the corner. That's not the condition report you need when you're spending $500,000, right? You need it black lighted, you need a full condition report. So that is our biggest concern, is condition. Now, that's what you kind of set auction house or European or Asian auction houses. We now also run into the issue of authenticity. So what's really, really important is that if there's a work that you're interested in, you need to make sure, one, it is authentic, two, it's in good condition. And then you obviously need to know that the price you're paying makes sense. So we always recommend you bring someone intelligent to assist you in that process.
You, Anita. And John, are you finding the same thing in the car space, specifically with condition issues? If we're dealing with online auctions and virtual transactions, can you just opine a little bit maybe on a few due diligence practices that you'd recommend as well?
Yeah, it's definitely with online auctions, it's become a thing to do videos of the vehicles. And so walkarounds, and also driving videos and startup videos. So you have a much better sense of how the car runs, how it drives, what are the flaws with it. And it's very, it can be subtle, but it's pervasive. I think that auction catalogs photos can hide some of the flaws, and it may not be very, obvious, but it's very helpful to look at a vehicle in person. The other things that are very important when, especially because you consider buying a much more expensive vehicle, is understanding the provenance of it and getting documentation. And so there are different ways to do this. You can hire an expert to look at the car. You can also, some of the manufacturers now have services where you can find out how the car was originally configured when it was built. All of these things are very worthwhile. They can be expensive, but it certainly is helpful to understand that, the car was in a wreck, was in multiple wrecks, it's had its engine replaced, it's been repainted. All of these things you might be able to find out when working with an expert, and that can affect the value. It does affect the value of the vehicle. So it's definitely helpful to get that documentation. And it's also very important to understand the condition of the vehicle when you're considering a purchase.
Colleen, I would opine that for many of our clients, we do what's called due diligence reports. They're basically both market analytics and full due diligence. And, it's a $500 cost. That $500 can save you $200,000. So it's a very small amount of money to do the due diligence that's necessary to make sure that you don't make a mistake. The pieces is what it says it is, and you're paying the right amount for the work.
And that's a really good point, because that's actually a tool that could be utilized whether we're in a COVID environment with virtual or not. It's just another due diligence practice that could be applied to art, cars, and other types of collectibles, just to help the buyer have a fiduciary representation around making a good acquisition and an investment quality acquisition. And on that note, Anita, moving forward, we're now in the end of January 2021. And everybody's talking about, well, gosh, what's going to be hot this year? What are the hot segments in the market? What should I buy? What should I sell? Can you share with us your insights on what you think is going to be the areas of both investment and possibly the best markets to be selling in this next calendar year?
Right. So a couple things to keep in mind. The first thing that's a very important tool for us, and it's been somewhat hampered by the state of COVID, which is that significant museum exhibitions are basically windows into the art world in terms of who they consider to be important. And there's usually a kind of a close trajectory between an important exhibition and the value of an artist. As you know, many exhibitions are not open to the public. They're not getting the attention they usually deserve. But that being said, we are closely tracking all of the exhibitions, both online and otherwise, that are either coming up in the next 1 to 2 years, and they're kind of giving us an insight into what may be happening. We're all keeping in mind the importance of the online platform as now a kind of accepted method of acquisition, which means a younger generation is going to have a bigger say in who the artists are of significance. And keep in mind that nothing against younger people, I have some sons of my own, but many of them have no background in art history. And as a result of that, they tend to buy things that are just digestible and understandable. And as a result of that, we're seeing many artists who, let's give an example at the Cause situation. So Cause is an artist that, many of us in the art historical world would not consider an important artist in the development and movement of art history, yet there are record prices for this artist, right? While Basquiat is an important artist, he's also important because he's highly digestible for younger collectors who have not had a lot of exposure to art history. So that being said, I think we need to pay close attention to those kinds of artists who many of us have always kind of poo-pooed important in the cadre of art history, but I think from a younger perspective, we need to look at, Banksy and Cause and a lot of the graffiti artists that people who are younger find very, very interesting. In addition, we need to pay close attention to female artists and African American artists. I continue to think that's a growth market in terms of acquisition appetite. Good buys, however, the paintings that are the highest quality, and we define quality by looking at 9 characteristics of analysis, right? And we want each of those characteristics to have a high quality work. Let's take reference. The Rothko market, and 10 years ago, this would be a very different kind of conversation, is quite stable. In fact, it's somewhat flat. So the opportunity to buy a Rothko, as an example, the best quality, right? Rare to the, new to the market, is a great acquisition today. So looking at some of those artists that are slightly under the radar, but are very, very high quality, that change the way we look at art history, are what we're focusing on for acquisition for our clients. Because we do believe that as COVID passes, older collectors, which I have to now include as myself, will be re-engaged with the market. In addition, with Rothko, for instance, a catalog raisonné is coming very soon, and we believe that will have an impact on the market as well. So on the one hand, we have to pay attention to the new generation of collectors, but on the other hand, we also have to focus on high quality works for the artists that change the way we look at art history as good opportunities in this market.
Great. Thank you so much, Anita. And John, are you finding the same data points? Are you looking at the younger generation, and are they influencers as far as what's hot in the marketplace going to 2021?
Yeah, there's definitely interest from younger generations, but it's often surprising to people what vehicles they're interested in. So there's sort of this myth that everybody's interested in the cars of their youth. And behind that is the assumption that it's only the cars that were new in the showroom when they were young. However, with younger generations, who are now some in their 50s, that means oftentimes vintage vehicles too. So the cars that were restored when they were young. So we do see a lot of interest from millennials in cars like the 1965 Ford Mustang. So vintage muscle cars, these are cars that have good performance, but they're also still fairly affordable. So we do see that. We do also see interest in sort of more specific cars that they might have played when video games when they're young. So that tends to be a much more of a growth segment that sort of uses some of those young timer vehicles that I was talking about earlier, those cars from the 80s and 90s. That's typically a smaller segment, but we see a little bit more price appreciation in those for those vehicles. And there's I think potentially a little bit better, more global awareness about some of those vehicles. However, going back to one of Anita's points earlier about the China market recovering, the market in Asia for vintage automobiles is very small. It almost doesn't exist. So typically we believe that these vehicles are owned offshore, so in California or in England. So it's a different dynamic in that sense. In terms of what to look for in 2021, we still see a lot of question marks around events, in-person events. So it's a lot of vehicles that you can use and enjoy for fun and don't necessarily need to display at a concourse.
Great. Well, we're coming near the end of our time, so I just want to conclude with just one last question, John, to both you and Anita. We have a large group of varying advisors on our call today. If you could give just some advice to everybody on the call regarding just your thoughts about 2021, knowing historically what happened in 2020, changes in the market, changes in the channels of distribution. John, why don't we start with you related to the car market? Can you give our audience just some advice going into 2021 and how to best manage clients with collections of cars and the market changes related to the auto market?
Sure. In 2020, the car market grew for us. So I think we expect that to continue in 2021 with continued growth, especially as people look for ways to have fun in sort of a socially distanced manner. In terms of which In terms of, sorry, what was the second question?
Just advice in
Oh
general.
yeah.
2020.
Generally, our advice is to buy what you love, and so clients, that's if you have something that they enjoy, and either they enjoy looking at it or they enjoy driving it, that's a better investment and a better use of their money than if they buy something that they expect to appreciate and value.
Okay, thank you. And Anita, we'll end with you and your advice.
I'll jump on John's point, but slightly take a right turn, no pun intended, with it. While we do want our clients to buy what they love, we want them to know that what they're buying has what the asset value is of their purchase. We want them to have that information. We also, sometimes our clients like something, but then we can point them in the direction of an artist that is quite similar in style, but actually will hold their value over time. As a firm, we're very, very focused on making sure our clients understand what they're buying. They're paying the right amount for that object. So if I was to give advice, I would say, talk to your clients, make sure that when they're acquiring a work of art, they know exactly what to pay and the quality of the piece that they are buying. Get advice is my advice.
Okay. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today. And John and Anita, a special thank you for all your insight and expertise on today's panel. We are going to end our 30-minute webinar for today. Should you have any questions related to the art or car markets, any questions whatsoever, please reach out to either Haggerty or Pall Mall Art Advisors, and we will be more than happy to address any of your questions or concerns. So thank you very much for joining today's call.